Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Jeff, the guy from Reston. Um, Anyways, we're going to talk about something that's very important tonight, and basically going to talk about some things that I saw today on this video. This is professor, and he was from University of Tennessee, and he was correlating how white supremacy was ingrained in the fabric of our culture, and how we take it for granted. Uh, and what I'd like to know, and I would love for people to leave comments after I finish the video, because I think this is very important to talk about, because I think we need to talk about it. And he said, white supremacy goes back to the founding of this nation, which was the Constitution of the United States in 1788. Or 1787, when it was written and ratified in 1788. And, well, here's the thing to think about. We were a colony. We had slaves. Most of the slaves were in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So that's where most of your slaves were. Now, in the American colonies at the time, because we weren't a nation. We were 13 individual colonies from Maine all the way down to Georgia. So you have to understand that white supremacy, what it is, what it was, why it was. Now, the Constitution and everything about the Constitution, there's never anything about white supremacy in it. Not even the part about 3/5 of a person who doesn't pay taxes, because they also included Red Indians in this. And that is, if you didn't pay taxes, you were not counted as a whole person. The reason why that was done was so that the people in the North who didn't own slaves would not be overrepresented by the census that where the southern landowners that had slaves could turn around there and use the population of their slaves as part of the census to get more representation. That's why they did it. Okay, that's why it was written into the Constitution. It wasn't written into the Constitution to make a person 3/5 of a person. And it was basically made so that people that were paid taxes. So if you were a black person, there's plenty of people that were black in this country that were free people, and that were free people in this country, and they lived and they worked. And, so the white supremacy that we're all talking about, okay, here's where the white supremacy comes from. The white supremacy comes from fear. The white supremacy, because when the founders first established the Constitution after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they turned around and wrote this incredible document after argument after argument after argument. They were there for a very long time, and they came up with these articles that we should govern under. And these articles would say what the power of Congress, where Congress had its power, where the president had a power, where the Supreme Court had its power from. They turned around and they specified what each branch of government had the power to do, and what it was able to do, and what it could not do. And they were very specific about this. And they wanted that for a reason. They wanted 3 branches of government. They wanted a legislative branch where they basically debated and made laws. They had an executive branch where laws would be enforced after bills were signed into law by the president. And then they wanted a court system that would judge the laws and basically find out where the laws would be, whether they would be based on the constitutionality of the law or not. That is the first thing we need to understand. Okay, now, did some of the things the founders did back in the day to preserve the Constitution? Could that be considered white supremacy? Probably, because number one, it was brand new, and they didn't want anybody to come along with a different idea and subvert it. They were that scared because they had just broken away from England. They fought a terrific war, the American Revolution. It started in 1775, actually, and went to 1781. So it was from 1781 to 1787 or 1788 that we were under a government called the Articles of Confederation. So, and basically, which led almost to economic disaster within 5 years, 6 years. So they had no choice but to go and make another convention and to turn around and incorporate the Constitution so that people and farms and other enterprises could make money and stuff like that. That's the reason why this was done. So because before that, they couldn't make any money. And each state itself was its own independent nation. So, or each colony became a state, which is what is its own independent nation. So now they did a lot of things to preserve the country, and one of the things they wanted to keep other ideas out. So now, would that be considered white supremacy? Probably. I would agree with you. And as a matter of fact, the Constitution, when it was first written, only applied to white men who owned land. So if you were a landowner, you could participate in government by voting for representatives. But if you weren't a white man, or you were a woman, or whether you were black or some other or an American or some other American Indian or something of that nature, you could not participate in government. You would be considered a citizen, but you could not participate in government. You would not be a thing. And the reason why was a good number of the country was illiterate anyway. As long as they were free, they didn't care. But the majority of a good number of the country, the people were illiterate. And if you were a slave, you definitely were illiterate, because in several states, they made it a crime for slaves to learn to read and write. So now, did it happen that some slaves did learn how to read and write? Absolutely, it did. You know, I would like to think that if the South had been a little bit more practical and they had educated their slaves, an educated workforce would have been a more productive workforce, instead of having people to be dumb and ignorant and to get up every day and work for 12 hours a day nonstop, you know. So picking cotton in the cotton fields, basically taking care of the plantation owner's house, whatever the case may be. The thing was, this white supremacy, and I think we need to deal with it. This is something that's very important, because we're not going to be able to go forward until we deal with the white supremacist issue. And so we know that the founders, now, even though the Constitution was written and it didn't say anything about white supremacy in it, we do know for a fact that they used white supremacy to preserve it. And that is why. And they were scared that they would lose this brand new country where they would live in freedom. And, certain guidelines had to be met in order to keep freedom and the Bill of Rights and everything. A lot of people today are not taught these concepts in school today. And this is why you have the riots that you see of a lot of young people out there. And they have every right to be upset. But number one, they're not taught history. They're not taught the evils of what happened prior to slavery, during slavery, and what happened to slavery. All they do know was that it was evil. And the fact that slavery was a multi-million-dollar business, because it netted the plantation owners millions of dollars to basically grow cotton, and other textiles to make for manufacturing, and they would ship them to to England and stuff like that, where they could manufacture all this into textiles that people could buy for fabric and other things. a lot of people don't seem to understand that it was a multi-million-dollar business. And the plantation owners, if they had to start paying their slaves wages, they would lose out on some of that profit. You know, me on the other hand, I think that what we should have done as America, we should have basically realized that after about a decade of being free, we should have realized that the people that work for us are slaves, that they're working for us, and we, we're doing an immoral service to them by not letting them be free. So what we should do is we should teach them how to read and write. We should teach them this. An educated workforce is a more productive workforce, and I think that would have ended slavery in this country. But I don't think people would have been so uh, uh, evil-minded. Other white people would have been so evil-minded toward blacks, because you had a number of white people running around here, which became the Ku Klux Klan during slavery and after slavery, terrorizing black people and beating them and killing them. I mean, so if a black person had the chance to go north and get north where he could be free, he would do it. Um, One of they had something called the Underground Railroad, which was nothing more than stops in certain farm barns and other things like that. Well, slaves moved north to get away from the slave masters from the South. Everybody did. If you had a chance to go, you would go. Frederick Douglass was one of those slaves. He left and went north. And basically, because of the law at the time, he was considered, he was considered somebody's property that ran away. And eventually, what happened was, his friends raised the money for his purchase and turned around and purchased his freedom for him. So he was a free man. The thing was the fact that a lot of people point to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln personally detested slavery. He didn't like it, but he also equated that he would let the South keep slavery in order to preserve the Union. And, he tried. He really, really tried. But that wasn't having it. The Southern landowners, because you got to understand, slavery was a multi-million-dollar business. And if you had a farm with a plantation, you probably had at least a dozen. You probably had a dozen field hands working in the fields. Okay, the slaves that had women, would the slave men that were, I guess you could, they would call it jumping the broom, or were married, would generally take care of the plantation house. Hence, not in all cases, but quite a few cases, though, where the slave masters took liberties with the slave women. This wasn't right, but they were able to get away with it because, number one, they were the master, and everybody knew it. So, if you really want to know a real fascinating story, go see the movie Roots. It was a book written by Alex Haley. It was about his heritage. It's a very good book, and it's also a very good movie. You'll need to see it. Some of it's very sad, some of it's very joyous. So, well, let's get back to white supremacy here. Now, because of what these people feared, what would happen by having a host of different ideas come in, they were afraid that their little republic would be overturned or curtailed and go back to something that is not good. Well, so could we call that white supremacy? Yeah, we could. Now, it wasn't constitutional, but Constitution does make references to people to overthrowing the government. And there are legitimate claims for overthrowing the government using the means in the Constitution to do so. But, most people don't know that. But in order to overthrow the government, you have to have a number of people behind you to do it, like maybe half the population of the country. You can't just do it by a handful of people running around there waving signs about white supremacy. So the other thing is, so we established that the Constitution was not racist. The Declaration of Independence was not racist, but the means of keeping the Constitution, they did use white supremacy to keep it. And the reason why they did was they feared so much in losing their freedom. Because prior to that, they were always bending how and knee to some king in Europe. And they didn't want to go through that. They wanted to live in a land where they could stand up and walk right. And now, was it right that Americans owned slaves? No, of course not. But you cannot stand here and morally justify using 21st century ethics on a 18th century problem. That's the one thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand. You're using 21st century ethics to an 18th century problem, and then in the 19th century too. And it wasn't until after the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney that slavery was, because you didn't need a bunch of people to go out the field to pick cotton. The cotton gin would just go out there, it ran on steam, it would go there, and it would harvest all the cotton from the cotton plants. The only thing you need people to do is go out there and plant new cotton again. Of course, then growing cotton was also detrimental to the soil, because if you grew cotton and you grew it enough, basically you would rob the soil or deplete it of its nutrient value, and then it would turn to dust and blow away. So they had to replenish the soil and do other things like that. They developed crop rotations and other things like that. George Washington's plantation at the time had more than one farm. If you go to Mount Vernon today, they'll show you a map of Mount Vernon and how many different farms he had where they employed crop rotation and used animal dung and hay as fertilizer for the soil to replenish the soil. Things of that nature. The white supremacy thing, however, which I keep going back to, we keep saying that there's white supremacy in our society. We keep saying that there's white supremacy so ingrained in our culture today. And the thing is, for all the things that are in the Constitution and all the protections and the Bill of Rights, plus the 12th, 13th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution were this. Do you know why there was a 1965 Civil Rights Act? The 1965 Civil Rights Act was put into place because people in the South that were controlled by Democrats were basically turning around and keeping people from voting. They didn't want blacks to vote because they didn't want blacks to overturn their, quote, little thing that they had at segregated society. They wanted that. So they kept as many blacks as possible from voting, which was a violation of the Constitution. The amendments, basically those 12th, 13th, and 14th amendments guaranteed the right to vote, to be counted as a citizen, and to have the same protections under the Constitution that anybody else that was white had. And the thing was the fact that if you're going to incorporate people into your society, Number one, you need to welcome them in. You also need to teach them how, why we have the society, why we want it this way for a very good reason. And the thing is, um, Democrats did not do that. Now, basically, because of the ugly history of our past, and we do have an ugly history of the past, most of it was never taught. Like, for instance, the bombing of the Illinois, the town in Oklahoma that had a black settlement in it. That was basically they, they had stockbrokers, they had people that were doctors, attorneys. I mean, they had every type of professional at the time that was living there. They had motorized cars, they had everything. And what happened? The United States government, using air power after World War One, when they developed, because the United States didn't have an air force, they were using, during World War One, they were using French and British aircraft to fight the Germans. So when the war was over, they started developing their own aircraft. And what did they do to use it? They turned around and bombed people out of existence because they were so scared that these people would become more powerful than they do. And that is a sad shame, because when you suppress people, all you end up doing is suppressing your own self. And that is a fact. Now, my father was born and raised in Pennsylvania. Um, but he joined the military. He was drafted in 1941 to fight in the war. And he trained, they sent him down south to train. And one of the things he told me, he said, because we had never seen this before, because, he lived up in Pennsylvania where, most society were not segregated like this. But when he saw the different standards that you had for white people than you did for colored people, then he turned around and he explained this to me. He said, Jeff, anytime you go and suppress a group of people because you believe them to be inferior to you, all you end up doing is suppressing yourself. The South may have won the peace, but they in turn suppressed themselves for over 100 years by suppressing black people. And, you know, this is why the South, up until just fairly recently, has not recovered from the Civil War, because these people down there were so filled with their own self-hatred and their own paranoia that they couldn't go to a person who was black and say, "Hey, listen, we want you to be part of the new republic. This. Teach them, teach them why we're this way, and all these other things like that. Who knows? Maybe some better ideas might come from it, you know. But you can't stand there and you can't brutalize other people. So the white supremacy that we're all talking about, I believe, is the hangings of blacks from the end of the Civil War all the way up until about 1965. As a matter of fact, how many black churches were bombed and destroyed by the Ku Klux Klan that never, ever, ever got reported or found out by local law enforcement, because good many of those people in local law enforcement were part of the Klan. So we need to look at what white supremacy is. Now, that being the case, how do we deal with getting rid of white supremacy? Where do we get rid of it? I mean, do we tear down statues of Andrew Jackson? He was the president of the United States. He did basically have that land bill that got rid of the Indians and started the Trail of Tears. That led to the Trail of Tears, where half the population of American Crow Indian or American Indians died. The thing is, not to mention how many blacks were how many blacks were African slaves, and then turned around and people out of fear do strange and stupid things. They really, really do. But You can't stand here and use 21st century ethics to judge a 17th century problem or an 18th century problem or a 19th century problem. And don't forget, the first slave owner in the United States was a black man. Well, it wasn't the United States then. We were American colony, 1619. He was the first slave owner and was a black man. So, you know, everything is not as lily white as you think it is with this white supremacy. And another thing to think about is I see a lot of people on Black Lives Matter that want to get rid of capitalism and put in communism in its place. I can guarantee you one thing, put that communism in its place. And I guarantee you one thing, you think you're suppressed by white people now? Wait till communism comes in. You'll be suppressed again, not by white people, but by people in the government. And they'll probably end up being Democrats again, because Democrats want socialism and communism too. So maybe you ought to think, how do we deal with white supremacy in society? You can't turn around and you can't talk to someone who's different from you and treat them cordially. Then what are you doing? Because American society is a melting pot. We've had blacks here for 300 years, and the thing is the fact that they've got every right to be citizens here as anybody else. And the thing is, if you want to end this white supremacy, we need to find out what exactly the white supremacy is. If it's something that we can end, because maybe it's something we can't. Maybe it's something that needs to be applied to everybody. I don't know. I don't have the answer for you. But I do know I want to live in a free country. I want to live in a free country where I can keep and bear arms right here and be able to defend myself, defend my family if I need to, and not have some snap DA like the one that's out in St. Louis there that's trying to investigate the couple. They used the Second Amendment to defend themselves from these violent protesters in the city of St. Louis. So the thing that gets me is the fact that these liberal people have come along and they have basically have used white supremacy to basically turn around and not only inflicted pain on blacks, but they've also inflicted pain on other white people as well. So the thing is, when you want to turn around and basically suppress somebody else, all you're doing is suppressing your own self. And anybody needs to take an objective lesson in history. And the thing is, this is now 2020. It's been 155 years since slavery ended in this country. We need to stop going back to slavery and saying, hey, this needs to be done. Okay? What we do need to do is we need to get rid of Democrat corruption and control of, or I should say leftist corruption and control, which is the Democratic Party now, of our institutions. Because that is where the white supremacy is today. It's not the Republicans, it's not the conservatives, it's not the nationalists. We have nothing to do. We have nothing. We want people to be free just like we do. We want more people to be free like us. We want everybody to basically understand that living in a free nation is better than living in a communist nation. And anybody and everybody knows it. And if you still think that having communism is the answer to capitalism, you're so deadly wrong. We don't need to go back to a unfree society because you basically have a problem with people who are basically white supremacists. This is the reason why a good number of white people are going to vote the way they vote. And it's not Donald Trump that's the white supremacist. You know, you know, he's trying to give you the keys to freedom, and you have people around here arguing against him. And he may not be perfect, no one ever is, but you know, you can't stand around here and basically victimize people because of something that happened 100 years before they were born. You can't stand around here and turn around and basically say, well, there's Southern traditions, basically that embroidered Southern gentlemanism and the way Southern ladies would act and the way Southern gentlemen would be toward them. You cannot take that away because of the evils of slavery. You cannot take this away because people suppressed other people. Okay, suppression is an individual thing. Well, I'll take that back. When the government under the Democratic leadership started bombing people, that was a collective. That was something that was a collective, you know. But you cannot equate police violence with people who resist arrest. You cannot stand here and equate people who basically commit crimes, and then when they're they're supposed to be put under arrest by police, and they fight the police, and it ends up in a violent death of the person they're trying to arrest for whatever reason, as racism. We can't go back to the past. And too often I see these people wanting to go back to the past. We must move forward. We must remember that the slavery and the white supremacy that basically kept blacks in America down, we need to make sure that it helps them up instead of keeping them down and makes them part of our society and makes us, hopefully, we can look at each other and not say that black guy or this white guy or that yellow guy over there or that red guy over there. There's a song I learned in Sunday school a long time ago at a church I used to go to a long time ago when I was a little boy. It's called Jesus Loves the Little Children, All the Children of the World, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Now, that song, to me, if we practiced God's love to each one of us, rather than trying to hate each other because they look a little different or whatever, and we try to practice love, peace, and understanding with each other, then we might get somewhere. But we don't do that. And if you look at the moral decay of our society today, that's a prime example of it. You have people willing to sell out the United States and live in a more restrictive society than ever before, just because they just don't like the fact that they believe capitalism kept them down. It wasn't the capitalism that kept you down. It was the supremacy by a bunch of bigots that kept you down, which I'm sorry for, but most of this happened before I was born. I can't fix what happened before I was born. All I can do is deal with the present and try to treat people as equally and as fairly as I would like to be treated. Some people are going to be more than others. I'm going to be more familiar with than others. But at the same token, I'm willing to always make new friends with new people. That's a fact of life. So, anyways, I want all of you to remember that, we need to take a look at our traditions and everything else like that. And if there's white supremacy, we need to deal with it to make sure that we're not being these white supremacists that we are, if we are a white supremacist. So, That's all I have to say on it. I do not believe I'm a white supremacist. I never delved in white supremacy. Am I a nationalist? Absolutely. Do I believe in freedom? Absolutely. Do I want to live in a system of government where my freedom is preserved? Absolutely. Okay. Do I like it when people in Black Lives Matter promote communism and socialism? No, I do not, because number one, that would not keep me free. Do I like it when a public defender, when a public prosecutor from the circuit court of the city of St. Louis would basically go and enact an investigation against a couple who lives in the city who defended their house from not protesters but vandals? That if they didn't have those guns, their house would have been ransacked and they would have been hurt, killed, or something else. So, nobody wants to hurt another human being. It's a fact of life. And if you want to hurt other human beings, then maybe there's something wrong with you. If you want to go and attack somebody else because they think something different from you, then maybe there's something wrong with you. We should be a nation of ideas where we take the best ideas that everybody has and incorporate them together. You can't have bad ideas. You're pushing bad ideas. So not everything that you propose is going to be pushed. We got to have a country where everybody is free. If everybody is free, then basically boom. Now, if you're a citizen, then you have the right to vote. But if you're a non-citizen, then you don't have the right to vote. But at least you can live in a country where you're free. And that's what we should be pushing. Everybody to freedom. And if we push everybody to freedom, where they're free, they know they're free, they don't have to be suppressed or this or any other reason, then that is how you end white supremacy in this country. When we push people to freedom, when we let them realize you are a free human being, you can do what you want as long as you're not violating the law. That's what needs to be done. We need to take a look at some of our laws, as some of them are unconstitutional. Fact of life. And so that's what that means. I personally think, and I honestly think, that if we turn around and we push people toward freedom, then white supremacy will go away. Because when people realize that they're free and they don't need to be victims, then the racism will end, the white supremacy will end. People will stop running around here screaming for communism and socialism, because that is the worst thing we can do. That will take even more of your freedom away from you. And, this is what they did in Germany. Like I said, you all want to believe Hitler was such a great guy. He wasn't. And he employed the Nationalist Socialist Party, which was a leftist party. He employed numbers of people called the brown shirts in the Nazi party. And they turned around and they committed random acts of violence. Pretty much what Antifa is doing today. Antifa is now the militant arm of the Democratic Party. They are not for this. Oh, and by the way, if you donate to Black Lives Matter, guess what happens to your money? It goes right into the Democratic Party. That's something that you should be aware of. If you want to vote, I believe in donating to whoever you want to donate for. If you believe that's the way to go, free country, do what you want. But just remember one thing. If you don't want to preserve the freedom in the United States, then nobody will have it and everybody will be a slave. And if that's the way you want to live, that's fine. But don't drag me down the hole and take away my freedom, because you can't basically understand that you live in a free country and you are a free thinking person. Anyways, this is Jeff, the guy from Reston, signing off. Take care, God bless, and have a good night. Bye-bye.